My name's Joanne Richards, and I'm the chair of Common Ground for Texans, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the 2020 to 2021. If you're not already on our mailing list, I certainly would encourage you to sign up through our website. We will promise not to inundate you with email messages in your mailbox. I did want to tell you that if you're not already aware, that the legislative session has begun. And in fact, Common Ground for Texans is supporting 3 bills on ranked choice voting. And we will bring that to your attention as the legislative session continues. It's not likely that we'll know who the committee chairs are until mid-February. So we won't be really seeing much activity until then. So with that introduction, we're going to do things a little bit differently this time than we have in the past. And I will turn the mic over to Mike Ignatowski, who's our moderator, and let you know that Ham Richards is going to be our technical assistant this time. So Mike, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Joanne. This is me on the screen here. And welcome everyone to our meeting today. It occurred to me that, leading up to the November elections, everyone said you should think of that as election week, not election day. And they were right. And people are now suggesting that maybe this is the start of the inauguration week activities, for better or worse. We'll check the news later and see. But I can't think of a better way to kick off this week than to get together in a group like this and discuss what are essentially going to be the moral roots of our political views. Now, we all miss the discussions that happen when we meet face to face. So today we're going to try something different, as Joanne said. It'll be something that allows people to be more active participants and engage with each other during the meeting. And since we are mostly a progressive group, that means we all tend to have the personality type that is open to new experiments, right? So let's get going. Today, we're going to watch a TED Talk by Jonathan Haidt. It was recorded in 2008 called The Moral Roots of Liberals and Conservatives. Some of you may have seen it already. And it actually was a preview of his ideas on our moral instincts that eventually led to his book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So Jonathan Haidt is a wonderful, thought-provoking speaker. He has since recorded a number of TED Talks and YouTube videos. The most recent was about 10 days ago and discussed some of the current events. Spoiler alert, the people who invaded the US Capitol do not really qualify as true conservatives. But that's for later discussion. This video is about 19 minutes long. We'll watch it as a group, and then we'll all get back together and we'll give you information about how we're going to discuss this with each other. So with that, I'll turn over to Ham, who can start the video for us.
Suppose that 2 American friends are traveling together in Italy. They go to see Michelangelo's David, and when they finally come face to face with the statue, they both freeze dead in their tracks. The first guy, we'll call him Adam, is transfixed by the beauty of the perfect human form. The second guy, we'll call him Bill, is transfixed by embarrassment at staring at the thing there in the center. So here's my question for you. Which one of these 2 guys was more likely to have voted for George Bush, which for Al Gore? I don't need to show of hands because we all have the same political stereotypes. We all know that it's Bill. And in this case, the stereotype corresponds to a reality. It really is a fact that liberals are much higher than conservatives on a major personality trait called openness to experience. People who are high on openness to experience just crave novelty, variety, diversity, new ideas, travel. People low on it like things that are familiar, that are safe and dependable. If you know about this trait, you can understand a lot of puzzles about human behavior. You can understand why artists are so different from accountants. You can actually predict what kinds of books they like to read, what kinds of places they like to travel to, and what kinds of food they like to eat. Once you understand this trait, you can understand why anybody would eat at Applebee's, but not anybody that you know. This trait also tells us a lot about politics. The main researcher of this trait, Robert McCrae, says that open individuals have an affinity for liberal, progressive, left-wing political views. They like a society which is open and changing. Whereas closed individuals prefer conservative, traditional, right-wing views. This trait also tells us a lot about the kinds of groups people join. So here's a description of a group I found on the web. What kinds of people would join a global community welcoming people from every discipline and culture who seek a deeper understanding of the world and who hope to turn that understanding into a better future for us all? This is from some guy named Ted. Well, let's see now. If openness predicts who becomes liberal and openness predicts who becomes a Tedster, then might we predict that most Tedsters are liberal? Let's find out. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand whether you are liberal, left of center on social issues we're talking about primarily, or conservative, and I'll give a third option because I know there are a number of libertarians in the audience. So right now, please raise your hand, down in the simulcast rooms too. Let's let everybody see who's here. Please raise your hand if you would say that you are liberal or left of center. Please raise your hand high right now. Okay. Please raise your hand if you'd say you're libertarian. Okay, about 2 dozen. And please raise your hand if you'd say you are right of center or conservative. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 8 or 10. Okay. This is a bit of a problem. Because if our goal is to understand the world, to seek a deeper understanding of the world, our general lack of moral diversity here is going to make it harder. Because when people all share values, when people all share morals, they become a team. And once you engage the psychology of teams, it shuts down open-minded thinking. When the liberal team loses, as it did in 2004 and as it almost did in 2000, we comfort ourselves. We try to explain why half of America voted for the other team. We think they must be blinded by religion or by simple stupidity. So if you think that half of America votes Republican because they are blinded in this way, then my message to you is that you're trapped in a moral matrix, in a particular moral matrix. And by the matrix, I mean literally the matrix like the movie The Matrix. But I'm here today to give you a choice. You can either take the blue pill and stick to your comforting delusions, or you can take the red pill, learn some moral psychology, and step outside the moral matrix. Now, because I know... Okay, I assume that answers my question. I was going to ask you which one you pick, but no need. You're all high in openness to experience, and besides, it looks like it might even taste good, and you're all epicures. So anyway, let's go with the red pill. Let's study some moral psychology and see where it takes us. Let's start at the beginning. What is morality, and where does it come from? The worst idea in all of psychology is the idea that the mind is a blank slate at birth. Developmental psychology has shown that kids come into the world already knowing so much about the physical and social worlds, and programmed to make it really easy for them to learn certain things and hard to learn others. The best definition of innateness I've ever seen, this just clarifies so many things for me, is from the brain scientist Gary Marcus. He says, the initial organization of the brain does not depend that much on experience. Nature provides a first draft, which experience then revises. Built-in doesn't mean unmalleable, it means organized in advance of experience. Okay, so what's on the first draft of the moral mind? To find out, my colleague Craig Joseph and I read through the literature on anthropology, on cultural variation and morality, and also on evolutionary psychology, looking for matches. What are the sorts of things that people talk about across disciplines, that you find across cultures, and even across species? We found five best matches, which we call the 5 foundations of morality. The first one is harm care. We're all mammals here. We all have a lot of neural and hormonal programming that makes us really bond with others, care for others, feel compassion for others, especially the weak and vulnerable, gives us very strong feelings about those who cause harm. This moral foundation underlies about 70% of the moral statements I've heard here at TED. The second foundation is fairness reciprocity. There's actually ambiguous evidence as to whether you find reciprocity in other animals, but the evidence for people could not be clearer. This Norman Rockwell painting is called The Golden Rule, and we heard about this from Karen Armstrong, of course, as the foundation of so many religions. That second foundation underlies the other 30% of the moral statements I've heard here at TED. Third foundation is in-group loyalty. You do find groups in the animal kingdom, you do find cooperative groups, but these groups are always either very small or they're all siblings. It's only among humans that you find very large groups of people who are able to cooperate, join together into groups, but in this case, groups that are united to fight other groups. This probably comes from our long history of tribal living, of tribal psychology. And this tribal psychology is so deeply pleasurable that even when we don't have tribes, we go ahead and make them because it's fun. Okay. Sports is to war as pornography is to sex. We get to exercise some ancient drives. The fourth foundation is authority respect. Here you see submissive gestures from two members of very closely related species. But authority in humans is not so closely based on power and brutality as it is in other primates. It's based on more voluntary deference and even elements of love at times. The fifth foundation is purity, sanctity. This painting is called The Allegory of Chastity. But purity is not just about suppressing female sexuality. It's about any kind of ideology, any kind of idea that tells you that you can attain virtue by controlling what you do with your body, by controlling what you put into your body. And while the political right may moralize sex much more, the political left is really doing a lot of it with food. Food is becoming extremely moralized nowadays. And a lot of it is ideas about purity, about what you're willing to touch or put into your body. I believe these are the 5 best candidates for what's written on the first draft of the Moral Mind. I think this is what we come with, at least a preparedness to learn all of these things. But as my son Max grows up in a liberal college town, how is this first draft going to get revised? And how will it end up being different from a kid born 60 miles south of us in Lynchburg, Virginia? To think about cultural variation, let's try a different metaphor. If there really are 5 systems at work in the mind, 5 sources of intuitions and emotions, then we can think of the moral mind as being like one of those audio equalizers that has 5 channels where you can set it to a different setting on every channel. And my colleagues Brian Nozick and Jesse Graham and I made a questionnaire, which we put up on the web at www.yourmorals.org. And so far, 30,000 people have taken this questionnaire, and you can too. Here are the results. Here are the results from about 23,000 American citizens. On the left, I've plotted the scores for liberals. On the right, those for conservatives. In the middle, the moderates. The blue line shows you people's responses on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness. But look at the other 3 lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality, I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a 2-channel or 2-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a 5-foundation or 5-channel morality. We find this in every country we look at. Here's the data for 1,100 Canadians. I'll just flip through a few other slides. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, the East Asia, and South Asia. Notice also that on all of these graphs, the slope is steeper on in-group authority purity, which shows that within any country, the disagreement isn't over harm and fairness. Everybody, I mean, we debate over what's fair, but everybody agrees that harm and fairness matter. Moral arguments within cultures are especially about issues of in-group authority purity. This effect is so robust that we find it no matter how we ask the question. In one recent study, we asked people to suppose you're about to get a dog, you picked a particular breed, you learned some new information about the breed. Suppose you learn that this particular breed is independent-minded and relates to its owner as a friend and an equal. Well, if you're a liberal, you say, hey, that's great, because liberals like to say, fetch, please. But if you're conservative, that's not so attractive. If you're conservative and you learn that a dog is extremely loyal to its home and family and doesn't warm up quickly to strangers, for conservative, well, loyalty is good. Dogs ought to be loyal. But to a liberal, it sounds like this dog is running for the Republican nomination. So you might say, okay, there are these differences between liberals and conservatives, but what makes those 3 other foundations moral? Aren't those just the foundations of xenophobia and authoritarianism and Puritanism? What makes them moral? The answer, I think, is contained in this incredible triptych from Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. In the first panel, we see the moment of creation. All is ordered, all is beautiful, all the people and animals are doing what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be. But then, given the way of the world, things change. We get every person doing whatever he wants with every aperture of every other person and every other animal. Some of you might recognize this as the 60s. But the 60s inevitably gives way to the 70s, where the cuttings of the apertures hurt a little bit more. Of course, Bosch called this hell. So this triptych, these 3 panels, portray the timeless truth that order tends to decay, the truth of social entropy. But lest you think this is just some part of the Christian imagination where Christians have this weird problem with pleasure, here's the same story, the same progression, told in a paper that was published in Nature a few years ago, in which Ernst Fehr and Simon Gachter had people play a commons dilemma, a game in which you give people money, and then on each round of the game, they can put money into a common pot, and then the experimenter doubles what's in there, and then it's all divided among the players. So it's a really nice analog for all sorts of environmental issues, where we're asking people to make a sacrifice, and they themselves don't really benefit from their own sacrifice, but you really want everybody else to sacrifice, but everybody has a temptation to free ride. And what happens is that at first people start off reasonably cooperative. This is all played anonymously. On the first round, people give about half of the money that they can, but they quickly see, you know what, other people aren't doing so much, so I don't want to be a sucker, I'm not going to cooperate, and so cooperation quickly decays from reasonably good down to close to zero. But then, and here's the trick, Fair and Gachter said on the 7th round, they told people, you know what, new rule, if you want to give some of your own money to punish people who aren't contributing, you can do that. And as soon as people heard about the punishment issue going on, cooperation shoots up. It shoots up and it keeps going up. There's a lot of research showing that to solve cooperative problems, it really helps. It's not enough to just appeal to people's good motives. It really helps to have some sort of punishment, even if it's just shame or embarrassment or gossip. You need some sort of punishment to bring people, when they're in large groups, to cooperate. There's even some recent research suggesting that religion, priming God, making people think about God, often in some situations leads to more cooperative, more pro-social behavior. Some people think that religion is an adaptation evolved both by cultural and biological evolution to make groups to cohere, in part for the purpose of trusting each other and then being more effective at competing with other groups. I think that's probably right, although this is a controversial issue. But I'm particularly interested in religion, in the origin of religion, and in what it does to us and for us, because I think that the greatest wonder in the world is not the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is really simple. It's just a lot of rock and then a lot of water and wind and a lot of time, and you get the Grand Canyon. It's not that complicated. This is what's really complicated, that there were people living in places like the Grand Canyon, cooperating with each other, or on the savannas of Africa, or on the frozen shores of Alaska. And then some of these villages grew into the mighty cities of Babylon and Rome and Tenochtitlan. How did this happen? This is an absolute miracle, much harder to explain than the Grand Canyon. The answer, I think, is that they used every tool in the toolbox. It took all of our moral psychology to create these cooperative groups. Yes, you do need to be concerned about harm, you do need a psychology of justice, but it really helps to organize a group if you can have subgroups, and if those subgroups have some internal structure, and if you have some ideology that tells people to suppress their carnality, to pursue higher, nobler ends. And now we get to the crux of the disagreement between liberals and conservatives. Because liberals reject 3 of these foundations. They say, no, let's celebrate diversity, not common in-group membership. They say, let's question authority, and they say, keep your laws off my body. Liberals have very noble motives for doing this. Traditional authority, traditional morality can be quite repressive and restrictive to those at the bottom, to women, to people who don't fit in. So liberals speak for the weak and oppressed. They want change and justice, even at the risk of chaos. As this guy's shirt says, stop bitching, start a revolution. If you're high on openness to experience, revolution is good, it's change, it's fun. Conservatives, on the other hand, speak for institutions and traditions. They want order, even at some cost, to those at the bottom. The great conservative insight is that order is really hard to achieve, it's really precious, and it's really easy to lose. So as Edmund Burke said, the restraints on men, as well as their liberties, are to be reckoned among their rights. This was after the chaos of the French Revolution. So once you see this, once you see that liberals and conservatives both have something to contribute, that they form a balance on change versus stability, then I think the way is open to step outside the moral matrix. This is the great insight that all the Asian religions have attained. Think about yin and yang. Yin and yang aren't enemies. Yin and yang don't hate each other. Yin and yang are both necessary, like night and day, for the functioning of the world. You find the same thing in Hinduism. There are many high gods in Hinduism. 2 of them are Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer. This image actually is both of those gods sharing the same body. You have the markings of Vishnu on the left, so we could think of Vishnu as the conservative god. You have the markings of Shiva on the right. Shiva is the liberal god, and they work together. You find the same thing in Buddhism. These 2 stanzas contain, I think, the deepest insights that have ever been attained into moral psychology. From the Zen master Senzan. If you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. Now, unfortunately, it's a disease that has been caught by many of the world's leaders. But before you feel superior to George Bush, before you throw a stone, ask yourself, do you accept this? Do you accept stepping out of the battle of good and evil? Can you be not for or against anything? So what's the point? What should you do? Well, if you take the greatest insights from ancient Asian philosophies and religions and you combine them with the latest research on moral psychology, I think you come to these conclusions, that our righteous minds were designed by evolution to unite us into teams, to divide us against other teams, and then to blind us to the truth. So, what should you do? Am I telling you to not strive? Am I telling you to embrace sense-on and stop with this struggle of for and against? No, absolutely not. I'm not saying that. This is an amazing group of people who are doing so much, using so much of their talent, their brilliance, their energy, their money to make the world a better place, to fight wrongs, to solve problems. But as we learned from Samantha Power in her story about Sergio Vieira de Mello, you can't just go charging in saying you're wrong and I'm right. Because as we just heard, everybody thinks they are right. A lot of the problems we have to solve are problems that require us to change other people. And if you want to change other people, a much better way to do it is to first understand who we are, understand our moral psychology, understand that we all think we're right, and then step out, even if it's just for a moment, step out, check in with sense-on. Step out of the moral matrix, just try to see it as a struggle playing out in which everybody does think they're right, and everybody at least has some reasons. Even if you disagree with them, everybody has some reasons for what they're doing. Step out, and if you do that, that's the essential move to cultivate moral humility, to get yourself out of this self-righteousness, which is the normal human condition. Think about the Dalai Lama. Think about the enormous moral authority of the Dalai Lama, and it comes from his moral humility. So I think the point of my talk, and I think the point of TED, is that this is a group that is passionately engaged in the pursuit of changing the world for the better. People here are passionately engaged in trying to make the world a better place. But there is also a passionate commitment to the truth. And so I think that the answer is to use that passionate commitment to the truth to try to turn it into a better future for us all. Thank you.
Okay, so in a minute, we're going to send everyone into multiple breakout rooms with 5 or 6 people in each room. We ask that you take about 5 minutes to introduce yourself to each other, and then about 20 minutes to discuss the video. I put 3 questions in the chat window to guide the discussion, so you can start with these, but if the discussion wanders off into other aspects of the topic you feel passionate about, then that's fine too. So everyone should open their chat window now with the clicking on the button on the bottom so you can see the questions. After we're done with the breakout rooms, we'll come back together and we'll ask each group to share 1 or 2 or maybe 3 golden nuggets of ideas that came up that really stuck in your mind during the discussion. You can have a spokesperson, but there's no need to take detailed notes or summarize everything, just 1 or 2 golden nuggets. And of course, we ask that you kind of clerk yourself and make sure everyone gets a chance to talk and the discussion is shared and civil. So with that, Ham, are you ready to send people off into the breakout rooms?
I am, and here we go.
Okay, so I guess we're all back now. I don't know how the other groups went, but that seemed to be a very fast 20 minutes for us.
It was.
It was people generally really liked the video. Thought Jonathan Haidt was a great speaker. About half of our group was familiar with him already, and half of them were not. I do encourage you, if you liked what you saw, to look up Jonathan H-I-D-T, Jonathan Haidt, on both TED and YouTube for all of his other videos. So let's go around and give a quick summary of some of the key nuggets of things that impressed you during the discussion period. I should have asked you to remember which group number you were in. So, yeah, we.
You can just call on a representative from each group.
Okay, well.
Ask them to volunteer.
Volunteer from group number 1. If you remember which group that was.
Yeah, that was my group.
We're number 1, I think.
Oh, that's right. I'm number 3.
Okay.
I have the list. I have the list of all the names. If you would like me to read them off.
No, if Tobin can report, that's fine.
Or anyone in Tobin's group.
Well, I was going to nominate anybody else in our group want to jump forward, but I think Rick was in our group. Rick, can you take us forward?
Yeah, the one nugget that really jumped out at me was on what was the first question? Sorry, I can't remember.
Fairness.
The notion of fairness, right, and the conservative notion of fairness is what's mine is mine. I worked for it. You know, I shouldn't be asked to give it up. And the liberal concept of fairness is more around equal opportunity for everybody, right? Just give everybody an even starting point. And then yes, there'll be disparity on the endpoints based on a myriad of variables, but an equal shot for everybody was the liberal standpoint.
Anyone else from that group want to comment?
Kathy?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about equity versus equality. That, making sure that people had the opportunity, and if you give everybody the same equal opportunity does not mean that everybody's starting at the same place. And that's sometimes what conservatives want is I think, well, everybody's got the same starting point. Everybody's going to school. Well, no, if you haven't had the younger opportunities with your parents reading to you and all these type of things, you may need a boost. So some of us, like I use the example of being short and needing a bucket to see over a fence, where somebody, my brother-in-law is 6'4", he can see over the fence by himself. So in order for it to be equitable for us, I have to have a bucket. So that was where we kind of felt the liberals were a little bit more.
Just don't kick the bucket, Kathy.
One hopes not.
Anyone else from group 1? Okay, let's move on to group number 2. Anyone remembers that they were in group 2?
I have no idea, but maybe if Ham could read off a name in that group, people would know.
Mike, I was in group number 2.
Yes. Yep.
And we didn't exactly get to all 3 of the questions, but a couple of nuggets were talking about, reading about something, listening, watching a TED Talk is a very different experience than living it. And along that same line, we started talking a little bit about, people in their tribes, that liberals seem to want to be more inclusive and have wider tribes than conservatives. And so their focus is different than someone who is, let's have it be for everybody. This can make a huge difference also in the community that you live in. And the examples that we were talking about were, when I get pulled over by a policeman in a community, I'm thinking about how this is going to affect my insurance policy. Whereas if I'm in a Black or brown community, I'm thinking about whether I'm going to be shot and killed or dragged to jail. And so just, the life experiences affect so much of what, and just being able to try to get to the point of being able to talk about something is very difficult because of all the obstacles that are in the way of just being where we came from.
Anyone else from group 2?
Yeah, we had good people in group 2.
Well, we also talked a little bit about equality versus equity, with some of the same thinking as Kathy mentioned about some people need a bucket to stand up and look over the fence. That concept also came up for us. We also, I think some of the points that were made about order, we sort of spilled over into this question too, as we talked about fairness. And sort of came to what some of the thinking that was offered is that maybe when you think about liberals and conservatives, that the definition of what fairness is different. It's not that groups don't think about fairness, conservatives think about fairness too, but how it's defined and who it's applied to is very different from a progressive group or person's idea of fairness. So that came up for us as well.
Anyone else? Okay, group number 3.
I think that was our group.
Yep.
And we talked about a number of things, and one of them had to do with order. And we talked about order from the point of view of that in order for a society to be functional, we have to have rules that everybody agrees to. And we started out by talking about the rules of the road, that if you're not in your lane and driving properly, then there are consequences that are catastrophic. And so we thought about the same thing in terms of order for a society as a whole. In order to move forward, we have to have rules that we all agree to and have some common rules.
I'll just add, the interesting idea came up that a commitment to truth is an important part of order in society. Without that, you really can't have much order. We also talked about the fairness aspect of various things. Liberals, very interested in everyone's treated equally, gets equal opportunity, no one's cheated out of anything. But we actually ended up discussing a real life example where there was a very long line and people were cutting in front of other folks. And that was a sense of fairness and being outraged that was happening that probably spans both a liberals and conservatives' sense of fairness. Mm-hmm. And we thought that was very interesting. Any other comments from the group? Ham, how many groups did we have?
Okay, 5 groups.
5 groups. Let's go to group number 4.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I was actually trying to take some notes while stuff was happening. So I did get some stuff down, but just over the basic, just thoughts from the basic presentation was some people just talked about how each side has their own set of facts or could have their own set of facts. Somebody pointed out that actually Jonathan Haidt has actually added another matrix for, instead of 5, there's now 6, with the last one being liberty. And let's see. Anyway, just the general aspect of people not being very open-minded to begin with. But in terms of the 3 questions, when it comes to fairness, yeah, this echoes what I've heard other people say, is just that for liberals, it's about equality. And for conservatives, it could be about like, are we doing our own fair share of stuff? Or the thing that comes up to my mind is taxation. And just that attitude there. But then in terms of order, for liberals, something that came up was order. Is everybody having what we need? And also the liberals have a slight aversion to just the basic concept of order. but also seeing it as sort of binding for a community and brings everybody together. And for conservatives, it seemed to us more that there's more authoritarian, there's like a hierarchy, it's hierarchical, I guess. It's focused on that. And then the third question, let's see. We talked about, you know, I heard talk about a sacred value or what's a value that people have that they just won't give any ground on. And that might be maybe that's most important, you know, a good starting place maybe, or that's noted in finding commonality. And then also the concept that to try to make conversations with people who aren't like ourselves more conversational, and just asking people to think more broadly. So those are my notes. If anyone else in our group has any ideas, just speak your mind.
Well, for the first question, and I didn't take down either mentally or on paper the level of detail you were talking in, but for the first question, I wrote down that the bottom line was justice versus fairness split. And for the second one, it was formal logical structures versus group processes. Hopefully that adds something.
You know, I highly recommend the book, The Righteous Mind, to understand these moral foundations. The distinction between equality and proportionality, liberal versus conservative, is very, very important. And also, in terms of how morality binds, the authority subversion foundation is where order is demanded, you know, more on the conservative side, and where hierarchies are much more in place. But we are pre-structured for hierarchy, as Haidt would then go on to say. And so order is something that, as I said in our group, important for liberals to take a closer look at, because it is probably a weakness in our two-prong foundational approach.
Great. Anyone else from that group?
Yes. I'd add a couple of points. We had a question raised about number 2. Is order multidimensional? And also, is order a matter of degree with processes for change that are well defined? So I think that's really relevant right now with our failure to observe process. Interestingly enough, the people you think most would like order are disruptive right now, which is kind of interesting. And intergenerational gatherings might help people connect ideas that they encounter at different points in their life, depending on their orientation. And we talked a little bit about Socratic method as a way to discover truth if you're working with someone who maybe has a different set of beliefs than you do.
Can I ask a question? If order is multidimensional, what are the dimensions?
I'm going to defer to, where are you? Is it Joanne?
Yeah, multidimensional in that I'm not sure multidimensional, I mean, I said that word, but I'm thinking that it takes on different aspects for conservatives than it does for liberals, in that, as we mentioned, it's hierarchical perhaps and authoritarian for conservatives, whereas order is about equality, equanimity, and a sense of well-being among liberals and how we view the society in which we are, quote, ordered.
I would add at this point, it's interesting how respect for authority may have overwhelmed desire for order.
That's very right on.
Yeah.
That's good. Anyone else from group 4? Let's go to group 5 then.
Well, that was me, Mary, Vicky, Gary, Ed, and Ellen. Nobody was appointed spokesperson, but I guess I can say a couple things. We covered kind of the same ground. We didn't move past question number 1. So we talked about fairness, and we talked about rugged individualism versus the common good being the 2 different concepts of fairness. And we also talked about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And affirmative action was mentioned as an example of a difference of opinion about that. Whereas the conservative would probably a lot of times be opposed to affirmative action because it's not equal opportunity based on merits. Equality of outcome would say that people from a minority background need a boost. And so that there would be a difference of opinion on that.
Thanks, Dan. Anyone else from that group? Well, this was good. Joanne.
So the only other thing that I would mention is that one of the things that we talked about, and I don't know if it's on our website, but if it's not, I will put it on the website, is that there is an illustration of horizontal columns. And there are 2 people looking at these columns. And one of the people who looks at these columns is looking at the spaces between the columns and says, there are only 3 columns. And the other person is looking at the columns themselves and says, oh, no, there are 4 columns. And they're both right. And so when your perspective, when you're coming to a conversation with a very different perspective, that's when you have to begin to examine where that perspective is coming from, that truth is not universal in that sense. And I'll leave it at there.
Janaz.
One of the things we haven't, doesn't seem to have come up, or maybe just is underlying, is the idea, is the concept of power. That seems to me to cut across. So in your graphic example, Joanne, if the person who sees 4 columns has power, then they have the ability to assert that their version of the truth is the truth with a capital T. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what, the group thinks in terms of how, to me, it seems that also then influences the ability of either group to assert the validity of their position and their views and their values. And so it's hard for me to think about these moral values or morality without thinking about power and how that plays into it as well.
That's an interesting point. I'll just say that Jonathan Haidt focused on what he called the moral instincts, which was good, but it's a limited view of some aspects of society. It misses out on how these things are enforced, which gets into power and other aspects like that too.
I think that may be why he came up with the other dimension of the freedom issue, because clearly those folks who were storming the Capitol were protesting for their freedom to control and to take back the House. And so power, they were definitely trying to exert power in antagonism to the governmental power and so forth. And so that issue of power is another aspect that is not as clearly included, or hasn't been as clearly included in this moral matrix.
I'm not sure that power would be an appropriate direct association with the items. It seems to me that power would have to be practiced totally differently under conservative versus liberal values, and that conservative structures would allow for a more hierarchical top-down power, whereas a liberal structure would require more of a ongoing buy-in kind of power.
Yeah, I think the liberal framework is more horizontal and the conservative framework is more vertical. But human tribes, from primates through the history of human civilization, have stressed the need for structure by hierarchy, and we all are subject to that to some degree, and it's definitely a strong part of the conservative moral matrix. And I truthfully think Haidt does not give enough. In his book, he doesn't talk enough about how power corrupts at the highest part of the hierarchy. That to me is a kind of a blind spot in Haidt's analysis. I think power is always part of the equation and corrupts absolutely.
And the loss of power is very threatening.
That's right.
Can I just say in defense of Jonathan Haidt that he's a behavioral psychologist, not a political scientist. And I don't think it's in his intention to come up with a prescriptive methodology for fixing these problems. What he's trying to do is describe how human psychology works together with political structures. And I think he's done a great job there. I think he's made I'm not sure that I agree that his breakdown of the moral virtues and the moral emotions will remain unchanged. He may tweak that over time, but I think he's moving in the right direction. I think it's up to us and everybody else to figure out how to use these tools to make things better. So I think what's happening here is what he wants to happen, but I don't think he wants to be the driver of that. This is my 2 cents.
Okay, well, thanks, Jernaz, for bringing up that important aspect of power. Good discussion here. I wanted to take a few minutes just to see what people thought of this process. We usually have either a guest speaker or a panel talking about this. And in some sense, we had a well-known guest speaker, but on video. And then we gave a lot of time in the meeting for this discussion. How did you think this went? Do people like this format a lot? How often do you think we should do something like this in our future meeting schedule? I'm getting a lot of thumbs up, but you can unmute yourself and make comments.
I go once a month, or once every 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, every once in a while. I think it was nice. I think it worked well, and I liked the group. It felt more like a Braver Angels session than one of our traditional sessions, which I also like.
There's some discussions that are nicely done in this kind of format. There are others that may not be quite some, because some of the programs that we do are more educational than they are conversational. So, you know, if we have a panel like we might have next at our next meeting in February, it might be more difficult to create a number of questions that would be that would generate the kind of discussion rather than the questions to the panelists for further clarification of their perspectives. We'll see.
I think also because in this case, we were not able to ask questions of our virtual presenter. This format worked really well. But if we had live panelists, even if they're on Zoom, it makes more sense to speak directly address their questions directly to them.
Well, we do have another opportunity because there is another short film that's called Purple. That's quite fascinating, that was produced in Wisconsin, and it would lend itself to conversation in small groups.
I think the format is more specific to what the subject matter is, because I thought the 2 gentlemen that were on talking about, I can't remember the topic of the last one, but they were talking about how to talk to people that you don't agree with.
Right, 2 guys on your head.
Those guys, yeah, they've been in my head since that meeting. And so I think that format worked really well for that kind of presentation. Of course, they're pretty engaging and easy to talk to. I think a lot of times it's nice to have a smaller group to talk about a presentation like this one, which is, you know, kind of, he didn't have any answers at the end. He didn't say, go do this and everything will be fine. So that's what was good about breaking into a group and seeing what other thoughtful people thought when they watched it and how it applies.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? So it's the experience of many people that a Zoom meeting that lasts much more than an hour gets to be taxing and hard to sit through. And we're already an hour and 19 minutes, and people are still staying engaged. That's a really good sign that this is a good group and a good topic. But there's also a saying, always leave the people wanting more at the end, and don't drag it out too long. So Joanne, do we want to wrap this up and talk about future events?
Sure. Yeah, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And we will have some programming in February and in March. And I'm predicting that in the fall, we will all be able to meet face to face. So cross your fingers that it will be possible. And then we'll have to decide whether we want to continue to have some people through Zoom and some people through face to face, because Zoom allows us to have folks from all over the country, whereas face to face doesn't. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for your participation, and we will put our video up with some comments about the conversation that we all had. So again, thank you very, very much. And thank Cam Richards for his technical support, and thank Mike for putting together the questions. And that was great. Thanks again.